But Craig is here right now, so let's bring him up. Craig Leinauer, Inland Marine Corporate Claims over at Travelers. Craig, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back. How are you?
It's been a couple months, haven't it? I think last time you were on, we were like getting ready for reefer, and we were talking about collisions and spoilage.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it seems like I was just here. It was probably a few months ago, and we were talking about, the most common transportation claims then. And I think I had mentioned that the most common are collision and breakage, but you're right. The biggest increase has been in spoilage claims to perishable cargo, which is up, as I mentioned then, about 30% year over year. So.
Big topic over when I was in the Future Supply Chain in Cleveland. Big topic on What the Truck all the time, especially this year, has been double brokering, the increase in fraud that's going on. It sounds like it can get you in a whole lot of trouble. What is Travelers? What do you guys see on this topic?
Well, this is a really big topic right now for sure. And I know recently you heard from Elizabeth Simpkins on your show, and she's one of our underwriting officers. She was here to talk about carriers, shippers, and brokers and what they can do to protect themselves from double brokering. She also mentioned that double brokering usually happens when brokers and carriers lack capacity to handle shipments, and that was super informative stuff. But in the loss and damage world where I work in corporate claim, we usually see double brokering in one of two ways. We either see broker to broker or carrier to carrier double brokering. Air quotes there. And each form of double brokering presents risks and problems to freight brokers and carriers.
Let's start at broker to broker double brokering. We've covered that quite a bit, but give us a brief elevator on it.
Yeah, so in broker to broker, what happens is the broker is hired by its shipping customer to arrange transportation. But then what it does is instead of arranging the transportation, it hands it off to another freight broker to arrange the transit. And this is done without the knowledge or the consent of the shipper. And so, this really creates some dangers and risks for the freight broker. The biggest risk to the freight broker is that there's usually a freight broker contract which prohibits double brokering. And when it's violated, the penalties for double brokering are assessed against the freight broker. And here's the rub. These penalties usually aren't covered by insurance. Also, when the freight broker doesn't vet the carrier themselves, but instead they give it to another broker, they can void their insurance coverage that's available to them as a freight broker. So really in one fell swoop, the freight broker in this type of double brokering can void its insurance coverage, and it can get hit with contractual penalties from its shipping customers. So it's not a great place to be. So aside from the threat of the contractual violation, there's also a big threat to communication. So there's a better chance that critical information like cargo special handling instructions, seal requirements, delivery deadlines, and that kind of thing are going to get miscommunicated when you introduce another broker into the mix. And this can lead to errors and delays and ultimately claims for cargo loss or damage. So aside from that, statistically speaking, also when we see with this kind of broker to broker double brokering, when you hand off the vetting of the carrier to another freight broker and you don't do the due diligence yourself, it really increases the risk of theft, tampering, or security breach. So if you're going to rely on another freight broker, you should always ensure that you know exactly who you're doing business with, and you can speak to their process for vetting carriers. Again, with this type of broker to broker double brokering, you can find yourself subject to contract penalties and also suffering an uninsured loss.
Craig, what if we cut out the middleman, right? Is there carrier to carrier double brokering too?
Yeah, carrier to carrier double brokering is really prevalent right now. And what happens there is that the shipping customer or the freight broker hires the carrier to move the freight. But instead of moving that freight themselves, the carrier hands it off to another carrier, a second carrier. And this is done without the knowledge or consent of the shipper. And so, as I said, this is very prevalent right now in the industry, and it's really fraught with problems. Right off the bat, the big problem with this kind of double brokering is that unless the first carrier actually has DOT authorized freight broker authority, that act of brokering to a second carrier is illegal and it can lead to fines. Additionally, much like the other kind of broker to broker double brokering, when you introduce a second carrier into the transportation chain, it can lead to miscommunications and breakdowns in communication around things like special handling instructions or specific security requirements, temp settings, that kind of thing. And this can increase the likelihood of damage or rejection at delivery. And then, when one carrier hands off to another, if that involves a physical transfer, then it's going to require additional handling potentially. And then when that occurs, that increases the likelihood of improper loading or unloading, and it increases the chances for unauthorized access or tampering to the cargo. And look, too often what happens in this kind of carrier-to-carrier brokering, double brokering, is that the carrier who's outsourcing the shipment doesn't confirm that the second carrier has sufficient insurance, or even that they have DOT authority to transport the commodity that's being hauled, the commodity in question. And so they really aren't conscious of the effect that double brokering has on their insurance or that of the freight broker who tendered the freight to them. So many times this simple act of double brokering can void all potential insurance coverage.
So they're coming at you from all angles. You got the carrier double broker, you got the broker double broker going on over here. What can they do to protect themselves? What can the industry do about this?
Well, listen, for the industry right now, this is certainly a big deal, and there's a lot at stake. Thieves are increasingly using sophisticated technology and AI to create elaborate theft schemes. Experts estimate that double brokering scams of this kind are costing the industry about $100 million annually right now. So it's a pretty big deal. And by the way, I should say that at Travelers, we have experts who can specifically speak to how to combat, fight against double brokering theft scams. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Scott Cornell, is going to be coming up on your show next month, I believe, to talk about exactly that. So you have that to look forward to. But in terms of your question about what can be done to safeguard against double brokering, it sort of depends on the parties, right? So if you're a broker, you should know exactly how your shipping contracts address double brokering. You should know that penalties for double brokering are not going to be covered by insurance. And in terms of insurance, you should understand how your liability and your contingent cargo policies respond to double brokering. And then, of course, where possible, you should always try to vet the motor carrier yourself, validate that they're authorized, licensed, and properly insured to haul the commodity. And then as a carrier, what you can do is you should recognize, again, right off the bat, that when you outsource a shipment to a second carrier, without actually having DOT broker authority, it is illegal, which can result in fines that are not going to be covered by insurance, by the way. And then you can also double check your shipping paperwork at pickup, make sure that it reflects you as the carrier. And if you spot a strange party in the paperwork, you should probably reach out to your dispatcher. And then, as is the case with freight brokers, understand how your insurance covers double brokering in the event of a cargo loss. Do you have a scheduled driver or a scheduled vehicle policy? If that's the kind of policy you have, you probably don't have coverage in a double brokering scenario.
Well, so what's the moral here in this awful double brokering story, Craig? Can you sum it up for us?
Yeah, look, I would say if there's any moral, it's this. No matter what form double brokering takes, whether it's broker to broker or it's carrier to carrier, what it does is it introduces complexities into the chain of transportation. And these complexities impact communications, they reduce transparency and also accountability. So, and all of that together contributes to an increased risk of loss, damage, or theft of cargo.
Well, hey, how do people learn more information about all this? I'm sure we got a lot of gears turning in people's brains who want to be safe around this stuff.
Travelers.com.
Travelers.com. Well, thank you so much. We learned a lot about what not to do with double brokering. I appreciate it. And, it's an issue that comes up every single time I talk to people. So, folks, I hope you paid attention. Take it easy, Craig.
Thank you. Thanks, you too.
Everybody.